What is up, most distinguished patrons of this channel? So I thought we would take a day off and go on a field trip instead of doing all this weld testing that I don't really want to get to right now. And we would go to the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, Illinois. That would be the United States for you guys overseas. And we would look at a feat of German engineering, aka submarine, or as they call it, a U-boat. In specific, that museum is in possession of U-505, which is a German submarine from World War II. It was produced in the early 40s, fought for a couple years, and then was almost sunk. However, we captured it here in the United States, and for whatever reason, it found its home at a museum in Chicago, Illinois, for all of us to enjoy. So we're going to start our trip out at that museum inspecting that particular boat. And after we complete our inspection on that U-boat, we are going to go to Manitowoc area of Wisconsin, and we are going to inspect a roughly same era, so early 40s, American submarine, and we're going to compare and contrast the technology, the build quality, and mainly the welds, because that's what my expertise is in welding. Not so much construction and not so much military history. So we're going to focus primarily on welding. And as always in my videos, if you have comments that you can add with additional details, feel free to, because I'm not going to be focusing much at all on the actual history of what we're looking at. We're mainly looking at the welding and the construction techniques. So feel free to add additional details. And for you guys that are interested in more details, read the comments, because a lot more information I'm sure will be available to you via that. So with that said, let's go down to that museum and start looking at what we have.
So to start things off, here is the museum section that's dedicated to the U-505. And I'll be honest with you guys right away. Number one, the lighting in this place, it looks good like in this photo, but on the actual ship really sucks. And two, they don't really allow professional photography in this place. And I wasn't about to bring my $2,000 camera and trying to start take pictures of stuff, get yelled at. You get the picture. So I was pretty limited to just my iPhone. And on top of that, when we go through the ship, it was very hurried. As in, you sign up and pay for a tour, you walk through it, and they don't like when you take too much time looking at stuff. So I did my best that I could to get pictures, but the time frame that I had to work with was pretty limited on the actual boat. So I didn't get as many pictures as I would have liked to have, or nearly as many pictures of the American sub. But hey, that's just how it is. You know, pay your money, get in and get out is kind of how things go here. But with that said, it's an awesome museum and you should definitely take a look at this. It's worth a trip. So with that said, let's look at some stats dealing with it. I'll put up a little list right now. The main things that are pretty cool about this ship that most of you probably are not aware of is it's actually a diesel-electric hybrid. And keep in mind, this was built in the 40s, but they use a diesel engine hooked to a generator in order to generate electricity that's stored in batteries because, well, you can't run a diesel engine without oxygen, and if this thing is submerged in the ocean somewhere, oxygen is in pretty short supply, so they ended up kind of creating a hybrid long before it was super popular and cool. But it worked well because even with limited technology for batteries, because obviously they didn't have lithium-ion batteries on this thing, it worked good enough for the day. And keep in mind, it's not like one side, aka the Germans or the United States, that one of them had lithium-ion batteries and one of them didn't. We were all dealing with kind of the same technology. But again, diesel, electric, hybrids, and the range on these things, which I'll put up now, was pretty substantial, aka when running on diesel, less so on electric, but again, you know, goes back to battery technology. Now, when it comes to overall construction of this ship, based on what I saw on the exterior, the quality of the welds were pretty decent and definitely better than a lot of the Russian stuff that I've seen in pictures. But as far as it being better than American ships, I guess you're going to be the judge on that by the end of this video. Here's a picture of the exterior of the hull near the top. And the welds that you see here are pretty typical of what the overall construction was. They ran vertical up as a weave, not so much stringer welds, which is pretty common from what I've seen on a lot of old vintage World War II stuff. The horizontal welds are run as stringers. As far as I could tell from historic photos and videos that I watched as part of the research to this video, the Germans did not appear to have any kind of wire welding processes, including gasless flux core, back in the early 40s when this was constructed, which is kind of interesting because a few of the welds I saw on the hull look like they could have been done with wire, mainly because there weren't like a ton of starts and stops, and the overall profile to me looked like a flux core self-shielded. But in all of the videos that I saw of these boats actually being constructed, the only welding I saw was stick welding, shield metal arc welding. So it's possible the whole thing was, and maybe just someone was really that good at starts and stops and restarts and all of that. Hard to say on that. There were a couple welds that looked like they were sub-arc welded, and sub-arc, no pun intended, it wasn't named after submarines, but sub-arc did exist all the way back to the late 30s. So it's entirely possible they did use sub-arc to weld certain pieces of this, but the actual majority of the construction appeared to be stick welded, which is direct contrast to the American ships, which a lot of those, even the submarines, were actually wired with gasless flux core, which would have been infinitely faster than stick welding when you're doing big long welds like this. I can't imagine sitting there burning rods all day. Like if you want to get something like this done fast, flux core gasless is far faster. Not necessarily better, not necessarily stronger, but definitely faster. This shot, again, you can see the stringer welds are run horizontal, which makes total sense. That's how you generally would do it today as well. The vertical up weld there is pretty smooth, almost looks like a different process was used. And one of the things I'll be upfront about right now with this is that this boat sat outside in Chicago weather for years and years and years, and this whole museum section was only built in recent times, so it is possible, and I didn't research it extensively, that the outer upper part of the hull is not original, as in pieces of it were replaced due to rusting or just basically falling apart. So whether or not this is 100% original on all of the welds on the exterior is up for debate. A vast majority of it looks very similar, and you can see like in this picture where it appears to have rusting on that material there, and it was just painted over after sandblasting. Most of this I would tend to believe would be pretty original. But again, to me, this looks like a wire process was used more than stick, but it's hard to say. Let's look at some more photos. Here's the upper part of the ship, and I gotta say, if they had a $50 or $100 option to shoot one of those guns on the top of it, I would have signed up for that in a heartbeat. But then again, it is Chicago, and they don't even let you have butter knives there, so I guess that's kind of a pipe dream. Anyways, what kind of surprised me is there's actually a lot of rivets on this, and I don't know why I didn't expect to see that, but a lot of stuff was riveted on this ship. Here's what I believe is considered the rudder section, and it's a combination of welds and rivets. And overall, I mean, the weld quality on the exterior of the ship really wasn't that bad, especially compared to a lot of the heavier equipment from the same era. Here's a picture of a weld on the bottom of the hull, and it's got a pretty wide weave. That was stick welded, and I gotta say, if there's one thing across the board on all the welds I saw on this ship is they did not leave welds with a ton of undercut, especially on the exterior. And that's something that I have seen on a lot of other military equipment. The old, oh, well, it undercut it, leave it, screw it. They had skilled enough welders to do this to where they weren't leaving a lot of defects. For the most part, we'll see some that are pretty scabby. Again, I apologize for the image quality here. This is a super dark area. But when I looked at this in person as well as in this crappy photo, I noticed that the weld quality, like on the exterior of the hull where it didn't matter, they kind of just, I don't want to say glued it together, but less concern was given. And then when you look at the welds, like vertical up welds or in position welds that were done on the side on more critical stuff, especially on the inner parts of the hull, those were by far better overall, which makes a lot of sense. You know, less critical welds like what you see here, which is closest to the camera, the blue painted stuff, where it's not holding any weight really. Who really cares? You'd put a less skilled guy on that. On more critical welds, especially on the hull that's going to see pressure, you're going to want to put someone who's far more competent or at least somewhat more skilled. And speaking of construction, here's a historical photo I found of the submarines being built at a manufacturing plant. And the quality of the photo, I apologize, there's a couple here that are just really bad, but hey, it's the 40s. What do you expect? Anyways, that had to have been one hell of a stressful job. Not only were you working with impossible deadlines, terrible working conditions, but the factories that built these things were bombed by the Allies multiple times, almost completely destroyed. So I don't know, I can't even possibly relate to going to work, dealing with all that, stress of what you're doing, trying to get stuff done, and then risking, bombs being dropped on your head. So not something that I would ever want to experience, and I hope future generations never experience either. Here's a historical photograph of a guy arc welding on an actual U-boat. And every photo I saw, every video I saw, again, I did not see any wire processes. It was either oxyacetylene cutting or just simple stick welding in the construction of it. You can see here that they're welding stuff in position, so they're running vertical up on the hull. They didn't rotate the hull from what I saw to weld stuff. Another photo of a guy welding, and he's got his rod and stub bucket right there. It would be interesting if I could get a hold of some of those old rods. From what I've read, a lot of them contained lime and asbestos fibers and all sorts of terrible things. I could imagine that the longevity of these guys doing this kind of work wasn't too long, lung cancer, of course. I guess it's not too different from modern welding, to be honest, as sad as it is to say that. Kudos to whoever welded this. They did a hell of a good job. This is on the top of the ship. It definitely appears to be original, and they did a really good job on it. And one of the interesting things that I found researching some of the stuff on this particular sub in German technology was that the Russians did an analysis on captured German equipment, basically, and determined that the welds were of significantly good quality and better than their own, which, well, based on the pictures I've seen of some of the Russian equipment, it wouldn't be too hard to be better than them, I guess. Anyways, let's look at some of the worst welds I've saw on this. So this weld, I really don't know what to think of. The left and the right of it actually look pretty decent, and then right here, smack dab in the middle of this, was absolutely horrendous. It almost looked like someone torch cut out part of it or tried to re-weld it with a torch. It's hard to say, who knows? This thing might have been built, launched, realized that it was taking on water, and then they just went back with a torch and then remelted it together to try and keep it watertight. And I won't rule out the possibility that somehow this was a modern day iron worker or something, that during the rehabilitation of this, that they went back and that was their fix. But whoever did that, that's pretty atrocious. And it definitely, I would say, is the worst weld that I saw on this. And it's not so much in a critical point. So if it is original, I don't know that it really would have been an issue, but it's definitely an eyesore. And I've said this in all of the videos I've made on content like this. I'm not here to make fun of anyone, and I'm here to encourage you guys out there to pick up tools and welding to try and build some cool stuff. So in no way, shape, or form am I making fun of anyone who's making these welds. But let's be honest here. That's what we're looking at is pretty atrocious. And I'm kind of confused as to why it looks pretty decent on the right and then just kind of turns really bad. Again, I think my theory is it looks like somebody torch welded over it to seal it up, and it wouldn't be too unexpected. Hey, if there's a leak or a crack and you don't have, you only have so many welding machines in a shipyard, and if they're used for something else and you just go up there with a portable oxygen acetylene setup or just a long torch setup and just melt it back together and hey, it's fixed. And this is a non-critical location, so not really too surprising that a poor repair attempt would be made. And realistically, big pieces of equipment like this and ships, I mean, not every weld is going to be perfect, nor do they need to be. Here's something that was welded up on the top of the deck there. And again, clear evidence stick welded, no doubt. Keep in mind that back in these days, you only had AC stick welders and pretty poor rods. So to get any kind of decent quality was almost a miracle, in my opinion. Here's a picture of the side of the ship that to me is clearly modern additions or repairs. And when you look at this, a vertical up looks like short circuit MIG without a doubt. It just doesn't look like the other welds. It's not consistent. And that stringer weld that goes kind of uphill, it just looks like modern MIG welding and poorly done at that. I don't believe any of this is original to the ship. And it shows that some of the welds on his ship from the 40s were actually better in quality than that kind of addition there. And speaking of modern welds, this is one of the support stands, we'll call it, the jack stands of sorts that holds the ship up off the ground. And the welds on this had quite a bit of undercut, probably doesn't come out too well in the photo. But I kind of laughed at that because, again, some of those 1940s welds with asbestos rods on AC only turned out better than modern equipment and well-trained people. But hey, that's life. Well, I think that we covered enough of this. Let's look at the interior of this ship. So now we're getting into the meat of the ship, the better part, in my opinion. And what you saw in the exterior was more or less a outer shell from the inner hull. The inner hull was more or less a welded tube that was welded in sections, and the wall that exists, which is basically the outer shell to this inner wall, was used, I believe, as ballast tanks, so it would take on water in order to sink and then basically pump the water out in order to float. So this section between the holes there basically would have held water. Now, the sub originally did not have an entranceway in the side of the hull. This would have been cut in. So some of the welds that I saw in here, I don't believe are original. They were just to spruce up this entranceway to make it look a little bit better. But that horizontal weld on the side of the hull, I do believe is original, that you see there in the middle of the photo. And that to me looked like it was done with wire or subarc. But again, all the construction photos that I saw of the submarine showed it being constructed in position and stick welded. So maybe that was stick welding, but they did a pretty decent job on that. So the closer part of the hull that's gray on the left, that was stick welded, as was the exterior hull, which appears tan or lighter in color because of that light. And the weld quality on the inner part of the hull definitely consistently was better. And I didn't take that many photos that show that, but the overall feeling I got was far more care on the inner hull was taken, which would make sense because that's what's experiencing all that pressure when you go underwater. The other thing that also changed, and you don't see it in this photo, but you're going to see it in other photos in this video, is when you got to the inner part of the hull, they completely got away from doing big gangster weaves on the main supports or the main structure, and they went to stringer welds and a lot of them. And that to me shows that they understood that doing big wide gangster weaves probably isn't that smart on something that's super critical, because you could run into all sorts of issues like cold lap, lack of fusion, slag inclusions, all of that, lack of penetration. So they changed the way that they were welding it in accordance to the stress, or at least that's what it seemed to be. Now, a bit of a disclaimer again. Most of the pictures I took were of like the welds and the construction. I didn't take really any pictures of the overall design and layout, and that's not really what this video is about. And I highly recommend, if you're interested in seeing more of that, then definitely go in person and see this, because there's really no substitute to actually seeing this firsthand. Case in point, how cramped this ship is doesn't really come through too well in videos. And now you gotta take it with a grain of salt, I guess. I'm 6'6", so I'm cramped in almost anything, but this particular ship was extremely tight quarters. Very little effort or engineering went into what I would call creature comforts. Like, don't get me wrong, they had a little bit of woodwork that was pretty decent that kind of reminded you that you aren't on a literal, like, steel tube that's probably going to implode in the middle of the ocean, but it's very sparse, no creature comforts, very uncomfortable, very tight, not someplace that I would want to survive for weeks or months on end. It smelled like diesel fuel, which for me, that didn't bother me in the least. It smelled like an old, well-oiled machine shop, so I kind of like that. But to survive on this is definitely not something I would want to do in real life. And the odd thing is, I've been on 2 or 3 American submarines, and by far they have more room. I actually fit on them, like, headroom-wise, and they just have more creature comforts, like, so much more thought process, money, and everything was thrown at them. This is like a simple purpose-built, everything has a purpose, and if it doesn't have a purpose, it's not on this ship. And it's just very sparse. I don't know how to describe it otherwise. This was a typical control area. Obviously, no computers in the 40s, so everything was manual gauges. Nothing wrong with that when they work. Here's a random hull shot. So this is the inner wall of part of the hull. And you can see that the welds are very clean, no undercut, no big wide gangster weaves that are out of control. Overall, very good quality. And when you see weaves, they're super tight, like what you see here, and clean. They're not hanging off the wall like they put down too much metal. That weld around where that valve hooks up, where that piping is really good. And again, the overall interior welds are exactly what you would expect. Very clean and apparently done by a competent welder. A lot of the roughness that you see on here is simply paint flaking that was painted over. I'm sure all this paint was probably lead-based, and some of it they did just to reduce the lead contamination, would be my guess. But this weld is actually a lot cleaner than it looks, and even if it was that rough, it's not that bad, especially because that was not really a critical component. All of the piping pass-throughs on the hull, this is typical of the welding for it. Not really too much undercut, and the overall weld pretty clean. The piping welds themselves were also pretty good across the board, so kudos to the pipe welders that did all the work on this ship. Here's another weave on the inner part of the hull, and very clean. To do that with even, say, 7018 modern rods, modern machines, would take some skill to be able to match that. So they clearly had a lot of skill for the more critical welds. Here's a support ring, or possibly a joint where 2 sections of hull were brought together and then welded, and this was basically designed to link the two. I'm not exactly sure, and I didn't have enough time to really get a better idea of how this sub was constructed, but based on what I saw here, they avoided doing big wide weaves or even smaller weaves, and I think they figured out that when you run weaves, you just have a higher probability of defects, and on something like this, just running stringers, despite it being a lot slower, probably made sense because you didn't want a failure on this component, because you would be swimming with the fishes more or less if a weld here broke. And if it wasn't all painted over, those welds were pretty crispy, clean, looked really good. Again, very skilled people were involved in making this. This video wouldn't be complete without showing at least one of the 2 engines that they had in here, and this is a big old Man Company diesel. The smell in here was heavenly if you're into gearboxes and oil and engines. It just had all the right smells. And that's what's funny, this thing hasn't ran in 60 years probably, and it still smells like you could fire it up today. I wish they could bottle that scent and sell it as cologne. I'd buy it. I don't think the ladies would like it, but I wouldn't care because it smells heavenly to me. Anyways, this big diesel engine was one of 2 that were on this ship, and both of them powered propellers via electric motors, and the batteries were on the floor where that guy in the picture in the lower right is standing, I guess. So the whole under area to where I'm standing here was all a battery bank, just a massive battery bank. I didn't look up what the capacity was, but based on the older style of batteries, I'm sure some modern lithium ion could have been 100th of the size with more power. You can see the amount of like support rings in this area to help keep the hull from crushing in. All of the welds were basically impeccable for stick welding. No undercut, no defects. They weren't doing wide weaves. Like, again, very clean construction techniques. Here's a historical photo of a guy machining a crankshaft for one of those engines. Pretty frickin' massive. I'm not even sure how long this actually was, because that engine, I believe, is longer, definitely, than what you see on that crankshaft. So that crank probably goes back another 4, 5, 6, 7 feet to the right of that photo. Pretty awesome. And it was made by MAN. I'll just call it MAN. I always laughed at that name for equipment. It's kind of, I don't know, how much more manly could you get than MAN for a name? But you can see the date that this was made was 1940. And speaking of that engine, this is a spare piston and connecting rod for that actual submarine's engine. They held a spare on the sub. I wish I could have got close enough to give some kind of reference, a scale with my hand or something, even though I have big hands. But that piston was about the size of 2 giant watermelons. Very significant. Had to have weighed quite a bit. I bet at least 80 pounds with that rod. Imagine how loud it would be to have a multi-cylinder diesel engine, 2 of them, running pistons that big inside of an all-steel hull with no sound deadening material whatsoever. I can't even imagine how deafening loud that was.
Here's an up-close picture of some of the piping, and for the most part, all of the piping welds looked, I would say, kind of like what you would expect to find in a factory nowadays. So there weren't too many that were real questionable, and the vast majority of them were decent. My overall opinion on the weld quality on what I saw on this ship was definitely a lot better than like land-driven heavy equipment. There's really no comparison. The quality of everything was far better on the submarine, which of course you would expect to see that because you don't want it to implode while you're under the water. But realistically, it still showed signs that you would expect of 40s technology, where, you know, differing weld qualities depending on whether it's on the outside on non-critical versus critical. Harder to weld areas generally had worse welds than the easier to weld. Everything was welded in position, which made it, I guess, a lot harder. And maybe not everything, but a vast majority of stuff like on the hull were all welded right where it was. So they definitely had a lot of skilled welders. And again, compared to American equipment from the same vintage, outside of submarines, I would definitely say this was constructed a lot better with higher skills. Now, the question of if it was constructed better than an American submarine from the same time, well, that'll have to get answered in part 2 when we look at an American submarine and compare and contrast the weld quality. And in that video, the lighting is by far better and there's a lot more pictures, simply because I wasn't rushed to do a tour. So we'll have a lot more content in that video for you guys to watch. In case you're wondering, this is one of the devices that would seal your fate when you were operating said submarine we just saw, and this is a depth charge. These would be set based on how deep you expected the sub to be, and you would basically dump it into water, and when the pressure increased on some sort of sensor high enough that it basically determined it was at depth, it would then implode. And you can imagine being in a steel tube, you know, I don't know, 2, 3, 4, 500 feet down and have something like that blow up right by the hull. It's probably not fun. And if you survived it, aka it was far enough away that it didn't damage your boat, I could imagine your pants are probably full at that point anyways. For the record, the welds on this were pretty good. I'm not really sure on the age on this. I don't know that it is from World War II, but they weren't bad. Better than they need to be, I guess. So on this last picture here, we have a hatch to some piping, and I'm not sure if that was stainless. It kind of looked like stainless, maybe aluminum. I'm not really sure, but some of the welds on that are pretty decent. But the story behind this is when the boat was captured and all of the people, the sailors, were on the deck of it, this had been opened in an attempt to sink the ship. Luckily, one of the American sailors found this because they basically entered the boat, realized it was flooding, found this hatch was removed, and they found the actual hatch, which is what you see here, replaced it, stopped the flooding, and then they were able to tow the U-boat back to America, basically, as a captured war spoil. And probably the most interesting story I saw while I was there is how the captain of the U-505 and the captain of the boat that ended up basically taking it over actually became friends after the war and talked and hung out, per se. So that was pretty wild. So anyways, in a part 2 video, I'm going to be covering a United States submarine from the same vintage. It's a slightly larger boat, but the construction and everything is significantly different than what this German boat had. And I'll have a lot more and a lot better pictures to share with you guys. So anyways, hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you got any comments, questions, thoughts, feel free to leave them. Until next time.